The vision of the Bonner Trust is gospel workers for the church in Scotland. Wonderfully and encouragingly, God is calling and churches are training and sending out a generation of gospel workers, young men and women, godly and gifted, zealous for the work of the gospel in their generation. The Bonner Trust exists to facilitate the nurturing, the training and the sending out of this generation of gospel workers. Let me set out something of the context in Scotland for the work of the Bonner Trust in three areas. First, Scotland's rich Christian heritage. Second, the state of the church in Scotland today. And thirdly, the emerging gospel vision and strategy in that contemporary context. Scotland has a rich Christian heritage. In many senses, a heritage that is unrivaled in the world. The Reformation had a massive impact on spiritual life in Scotland. Here we are in St Andrews at the site of Patrick Hamilton's martyrdom, a young man aged 24 who paid the ultimate price for his commitment to Christ in his generation. In the 19th century, Thomas Chalmers, one of Scotland's greatest sons, had a twofold vision for the work of the gospel. On the one hand, his vision was for church planting. He called it church extension. And in the space of barely 10 years, Thomas Chalmers' leadership had pioneered the planting, the building, the establishing, the funding, the populating of nearly 500 churches in Scotland. But the second aspect of Thomas Chalmers' vision, that he considered to be his greatest work and contribution, was nurturing a generation of young leaders for these churches. Men like Robert Murray McCheyne, Andrew and Horatius Bonner. The Bonner Trust takes its name from the Bonner brothers. And God used that generation singularly in the 19th century to bring about revival and renewal in the work of the gospel. That's our rich Christian heritage. But what of the state of the church in Scotland today? Well, it's a very, very different story. Scotland, at the beginning of the 21st century, is one of the leading secular countries in Europe. Secularism has swept into Scotland to a far greater extent than the rest of the UK. In this secular context, Scotland's two big historic denominations, the Church of Scotland, the Kirk, the National Church in Scotland, and the Scottish Episcopal Church, are now two of the leading revisionist or liberal denominations in the world. Over the last decade, these two big denominations have enshrined in their church laws and statutes decisions which represent a clear departure and rejection of the Bible as the supreme authority for the church's life. These decisions have spiraled these two denominations into rapid and terminal decline. And yet they leave a huge, huge vacuum, indeed a mountain to fill. And there is no doubt that our contemporary context presents huge challenges. So thirdly, what is there by way of vision and strategy in response to these challenges? Well, wonderfully, God is putting into the hearts and minds of many people across this country a vision that in many senses replicates the vision of Thomas Chalmers in the 19th century, church planting and training gospel workers. Church planting in Scotland today is no longer regarded as novel, but as normal. Churches with resources are planting churches. Many of the young emerging leaders have a vision to be church planters. Groups like Generation, birthed out of the Free Church of Scotland, are pioneering church planting, north, south, east and west, in urban contexts, in rural contexts, in university towns, in housing schemes, some of the poorest parts in our countries, churches are being planted. And of course, when a church is planted, that church has a vision to plant more churches. That's one aspect of the emerging gospel vision and strategy in Scotland today. The other, just like the 19th century, is training and nurturing a generation of young leaders. And that is where the Bonner Trust fits in. Now, training a generation of leaders is underground, unseen work, helpfully described as pipeline work underground. And the vision of the Trust, working with many others, is to see the flow through of that pipeline now and in the next decade and for generations to come of leaders for these churches in Scotland. And wonderfully, God is calling and churches are beginning to raise out and send these gospel workers. The Bonner Trust exists to invest in them, to invest in their training and ensure that they are fit leaders for the church in this country.